This video is part 3 of Chapter 9, Social Psychology for PSY 110S, the Psychological Sciences. In this part of the chapter, we're going to talk about why we obey. As I mentioned in the first part of this chapter, our default kind of position as social creatures is to be pretty compliant and to conform often. The same goes for obedience. While we tend to say, especially in Western cultures, we tend to say that we prefer these people who are mavericks, who are independent, who do what they want, and pursue their own agendas. By and large, we prefer obedience in the people around us. So when psychologists talk about obedience, they're talking about following commands of people in authority. So it's a specific kind of compliance. Remember how compliance is when someone makes a direct request of you. They may be your equal, they may be your subordinate even. So obedience is specifically situations where someone has authority over you and asks you to do something and expects your obedience. Obedience is often really good for us. So if you do what you're told in an emergency situation by people who are in charge, keeps you safe. If you obey traffic laws, keeps everybody safe, and so on. So, obedience can be constructive. It can be helpful. It can also be very destructive. So early social psychologists really looked hard at situations like the patterns of behavior that emerged in Nazi Germany, including the Holocaust and the My Lai massacre in Vietnam, as critical examples of how mindless obedience to authority or obedience to authority in extreme situations can lead to very, very bad outcomes. In those kinds of situations where you have destructive obedience, it's many of these early social psychologists argued it's not that these were bad people. So there were, in the newspapers during World War II, there was a lot of vilification of German citizens, saying that it's because they're German that they're doing these things. That's just, German people are evil. And these psychologists were like, wait a minute, that doesn't make any sense. It makes more sense that the situation was constructed in such a way that obedience became the most likely outcome, even if it was obedience in service of evil goals. So they argued that it was the situation, not the person, that is largely the explanation for those sorts of situations. That led them to make theories that suggested that situational factors, when you manipulate them, you can show how destructive obedience emerges. Now, probably the most famous and infamous research examples in this area is the work of Stanley Milgram. And most of you have probably heard about Milgram's research on obedience to authority. And there are lots of criticisms, so I'm going to, put it out here, let you watch a little bit of original footage from some of Milgram's work, and then I'll talk more about it.
You want to step right in here, learner, and have a seat there. You can leave your coat on the back of that chair if you will, please. Take it right off. That's fine. Have a seat right here. Pull yourself right up to the counter, please. Teacher, you may look on if you'd like while we get set up in here. Would you roll up your right sleeve, please? Left. Fine. Now what I'm going to do is strap down your arms to avoid any excessive movement on your part during the experiment. Is that too tight? Okay. This electrode is connected to the shock generator in the next room. And this electrode paste is to provide a good contact to avoid any blister or burn. Answer, please. Wrong. Answer is neck. 300 volts.
I absolutely refuse to answer anymore. Get me out of here. You can't harm me here. Get me out. Get me out of here.
Continue. The next word is green, please. Green. Grass, hat, ink, apple. Okay, well, I will answer. If the learner doesn't answer in a reasonable time, about 4 or 5 seconds, consider the answer wrong and follow the same procedures you have been doing for wrong answers. Say wrong, tell them the number of volts, give them the punishment, and give the correct answer. Oh, man. Continue, please. Green. Grass, hat, ink, apple. Answer, please. Go on with the procedure, please, teacher. 315 volts. The answer is ink. Next one. Well, you gotta keep getting a shock if you don't answer. The next one is rich. 330 volts.
Let me out of here. Let me out of here. My heart's bothering me.
Next one.
Let me out. Let me out of here. You have no right to hold me here. Let me out. Let me out. Let me out.
Excellent. Fast.
Let me out. Let me out.
Bird. Car. Train. Plane. Go on, please, with the procedure. Please answer. The answer is bird. 345 volts. Blunt. Knife, stick, word, arrow. Answer, please. Continue, please. The answer is arrow. 360 volts. Go on, please, with the experiment. Please continue. Soft. Rug, pillow, hair, grass. Answer, please. Go on, teacher. Hair, 375 volts. I think something's happened to that fellow in there. I don't get no answer. He was hollering with less voltage. Can't you check in to see if he's all right, please? Not once we've started. Please continue, teacher. Cool. Day, shade, water, cave. Answer, please. Are you all right in there? Are you all right? Please continue, teacher. Oh, no, I keep giving him shocks? Continue, please. I'm up to 390. Continue, please. Something's happened to that man in there.
So that's some archival footage from the usual design of Milgram's study. Basically, what Milgram did was set up a situation where volunteers, and these were people in the original study, these were adult men who were recruited through newspaper advertisements, offering them a small amount of cash for participation in a study on the effects of punishment in learning. So they're not told that they're studying obedience to authority. They're told that they're studying learning and punishment. And the setup involves, as you were shown in the video, this elaborate mechanical device, this shock generator, that appears to, goes all the way from a very low level of shock up to a very high level of shock, and everything printed on that shock board is designed to be persuasive. It's designed to communicate to the participant that you are going to be delivering electric shocks to another person, to another human being. A test shock at a very low level, like roughly equivalent to when if you got your finger on a plug when you're pulling it out of an outlet, that level of shock. And that's to enhance the realism for the participant, so that they will believe that they are actually delivering electric shocks to another person. When participants arrive, they arrive, with another person that they believe is also a participant just like them. There's a staged drawing to decide who's going to be the teacher and who's going to be the learner. The other person is an actor whose job it is to play the role of the learner, and that person is always going to get that role. So there's one naive participant in the setup, where the naive participant gets the role of the teacher, and the other participant, who is a Confederate, becomes the learner. The teachers often were asked to watch as the learner goes into an adjoining room and is strapped into a chair and connected to the shock generator. The teachers are led to believe that they're giving increasing levels of shock with each mistake that the learner makes. Now, there's a pre-programmed script that the learner is going to follow. So they're going to make mistakes at an increasing level over time. So every mistake has to be shocked at a higher level as people go on. Now, in the first version of the study, when Milgram set this up, there weren't, as you saw in the video, you didn't have the learner kind of crying out in pain or talking about their heart, having heart problems or anything like that. Milgram decided to add those because he wasn't convinced that participants were really believing that they were hurting another person. So he wanted to make sure that that was actually real to the participants. Now, what he found, and he did the study multiple times with multiple variations in different locations with different populations, and what he found was that, or let's start with what he predicted. He predicted fairly high levels of obedience, but when he asked other people, including other psychologists and psychiatrists, most of them thought that people would quit early, that they would stop at relatively low levels of shock. The psychiatrists that he asked to predict the outcome, they said very few people would go to the end of the shock board, and the only ones who would be the pure sadists, people who really get off on hurting other people. And that's really not what was found. Milgram found that about 2/3, 2 out of every 3 participants, completed the study and went to the maximum shock level. So about 2/3 of people continued to obey all the way up to the maximum. And that's even, past the point where the learner stops responding at all. Now, it's not that they blissfully just kept doing their job. As you saw in the video, they often argued, they often tried to help the learner, they often tried to find ways to circumvent the system, so that they were not shocking as hard. So you might have noticed how early in that video the man holds the shock lever down longer at the beginning than at the end, where he just sort of taps it really fast, as if that's going to give the person more comfort. He also found that the situation made a really caused a lot of strain. So as you saw in the video, the guy sort of gives these awkward, some people interpret it as laughter or snorting. It's a stress response that he's giving. He repeatedly asks the experimenter, will you check on this guy? Will you do this? So there's conflict there that for Milgram represented emotional strain. But for a lot of the participants, they look at the experimenter as an authority figure, and that authority being, someone in a white coat who's an experimenter at a respected institution. You can only question that person so far, especially at that time. So when we try to interpret the findings, you start with the fact that there's a difference between what we say we'll do and what we'll actually do. And it's that gap represents the power of situational factors. So Milgram's whole purpose for doing the research was to show that you could construct a situation in such a way that you could maximize obedience, and that obedience could actually be in a form that could harm other people. But he also wanted to show that if you tweak that situation, you can decrease obedience dramatically. In the original setup, you have both informational and normative social influence in play. The informational side, it is confusing. You don't, in your everyday life, you are not invited to shock people with an electric shock device in order to encourage them to do certain things. He was able to show that confusion would lead people to follow the lead of the authority figure. There's also normative social influence. The expectations of a situation where you are a participant in a study and the study is being conducted by the experimenter. The experimenter sets the normative tone for the situation. Now, a variety of physical factors, or situational factors rather, are heavily in play, and each one of these were treated by Milgram as variables in later versions of the study. So he manipulated the physical presence of the experimenter. If the experimenter is in the room, obedience is at its highest level. If the experimenter is outside the room communicating with the teacher by phone or by intercom, obedience goes down and cheating goes up. You can also manipulate the closeness of the teacher and the learner. So in the original study, the learner is in a separate room and cannot be seen, let alone touched by the teacher. In some versions of the study, the wall was replaced by plexiglass so that the teacher could see the learner. That decreased obedience. Then when in some situations the plexiglass was removed, so that increases closeness. Another variation was to move the learner right next to the teacher, sitting on the same side of a table. And then in the most physically close situation, in order to deliver the shock, the teacher had to pick up the learner's hand and place it on a shock plate in order to deliver the punishment. The closer the proximity between the teacher and the learner, the lower the level of obedience and the increased likelihood of the teacher quitting the experiment early. When he manipulated the location of the study, there were impacts on obedience. The original study was done on the campus of a prestigious university, in an academic building, in an academic laboratory. So the participants had to come to campus into this very pristine environment. In later versions of the study, they rented a storefront in a downtown location. Not that it was completely run down or anything, but it was not on a prestigious campus. In that setting, the rates of obedience decreased somewhat. If you add additional experimenters, so in the original study, there was only one experimenter. In later versions, there were two. When the experimenters started to disagree with each other about whether to continue or whether to check on the learner, then the obedience levels of the participants went down, sometimes by a great deal. And then, there were also manipulations of perceived responsibility of the teacher. If the teachers were told that it was their responsibility to take care of the learner, obedience went way down. So if they were made responsible for the outcomes, they tended to behave more independently and more consistently with their own values. In later follow-up studies, and this was a long experimental program that Milgram conducted, he didn't find a lot of differences based on biological sex or based on culture. There had been some arguments that some cultures would be hyper-obedient, but Milgram felt if you set up the situation, it's more about being human as opposed to being from a particular culture that creates these outcomes. Now, there have been a lot of criticisms of Milgram's work. At the time, Diana Baumrind, as your authors note, had really strong criticisms of Milgram based on ethics. Now, when Milgram was doing his work, let me be clear, we didn't have the kinds of ethical oversight of psychological science that we do now. There were, in some cases, there were internal reviews, but in many, at many universities, there just wasn't a lot of ethical training or ethical oversight. Baumrind was really unhappy with the way Milgram treated the participants. She argued that he had inflicted emotional harm on them. It was possible that this was irreparable harm. She argued that he traumatized them into believing that they were possibly killing another human being. She also argued that the findings may have lacked external validity. And basically, external validity refers to the degree to which the results can be generalized to other situations. And she claimed that, it was a leap to say that his particular paradigm was a good fit for the kinds of atrocities that Milgram was trying to study, like the Holocaust, for example. So let's visit some of these criticisms a little more deeply. There are elements of what Milgram did that you just wouldn't be able to conduct the research in the same way that Milgram did. So there are a lot of violations of modern ethical standards, such as rigorous informed consent and rigorous debriefing. While Milgram stated that he debriefed, there is some evidence from archival materials that he wasn't particularly consistent about doing that. There have been follow-up studies that showed that the majority of the participants were not disturbed, not distressed by their participation. While they found it distressing to do, permanent impacts were not reported. But that doesn't let Milgram off the hook. Just because really, really bad outcomes didn't happen doesn't mean that, it makes it okay to do things in the way that Milgram did. Recent research of the archival record has revealed some disturbing things. Debriefing was, as I just mentioned, not particularly well done It wasn't transparent. There were some misrepresentations and problems that authors have identified in that record. There appears to have been some experimental bias on the part of Milgram and his colleagues in the work that they were doing. And they didn't always, there has been a contention that Milgram cherry-picked findings to report. Now, that's a little harder to document. If you're really, really interested in some of this, there are books out about Milgram and about his work, especially the more recent reports that came out really kind of looking hard at the record. Now, I mentioned Baumrein. Perry's book, more recently, really does call into question some of the basic assumptions about the research. So my kind of take on it is Milgram was a very crafty, creative researcher. He designed a solid experimental paradigm. His procedures violate current ethical standards that weren't in place at the time, and can be described as being, bordering on the line of abusive. There were, I do find persuasive some of the arguments that Perry makes in their book, but I don't think it invalidates all of the findings. The primary finding is you can structure a situation that makes obedience, even obedience to requests to do bad things, much, much more likely. I think that holds, that part of it holds. What these criticisms point out, though, is some important things. Number one, at the time, we didn't have ethics standards and practices in place to really inform researchers as to what their rights and responsibilities are. And that includes communicating to participants what their rights are in experimental situations. It also shows that, Milgram was a flawed person. He was a bit of a grandstander. And he was using his science to make a point, to make a public point, and that's always kind of a dangerous thing to do. If you have an axe to grind, it may lead you to misrepresent your findings, to make them look more consistent with what the point that you're trying to make. And that's a dangerous thing for scientists to get involved in. There have been some replications, as I mentioned, though. There are ethical procedures in place now. All colleges and universities, any institution that accepts federal funding has to follow the federal guidelines to have your experimental procedure reviewed by a board called an institutional review board, which is made up of not just psychologists, but people from across the institution and people from the wider community. And you have to present a cost-benefit analysis. So Berger's replication was partial because the Milgram paradigm as it was initially set up couldn't be repeated in exactly the same way because it would be unethical to do so. So Berger, the main procedural change was that once the participants pushed the 150-volt switch and started to read the next test item, the experiment stopped. So that voltage point was chosen because once the participants went past that point, the majority of participants in Milgram's original study continued. So once they reached that threshold, obedience just sort of plateaus, and people continue. In the Berger study in 2015, the findings were basically replicated. So, some critics of Milgram have called for just sort of throwing out his work entirely because of his misbehavior. But these replications show, pretty much the same reactions in as they did in the original study. Now, there was some evidence of greater levels of disobedience than in the past, but people reacted in this obedience situation in 2015 very much like they did 50 years before. In a meta-analysis of studies that were repetitions of Milgram's paradigm, there was evidence that that 150 volt point was a critical juncture. So once they hit that point, they're likely to continue on. They'll either quit or they'll be obedient going forward. Gibson and others, the experimenters, they did some manipulations of how the experimenters spoke to the research participants, and the experimenters would tend to use orders, and when those orders were directed, Gibson found that because they were really looking, this was what's called a rhetorical analysis of the interactions, and order-like prods tended to be resisted. So in their analysis, they were showing that Milgram's participants were obeying orders of those in authority, even though they showed some resistance to them. So Milgram's studies seem to show evidence that orders from an authority can lead to actual disobedience, and that the obedience was due to other kinds of situational factors. So it's not so much what the experimenter was demanding, although that's a part of it. It's the holistic social situation, not just the authority figure, that is increasing the level of obedience. Now, Riker and Haslam and others, they amplified this in their assessments, and I argued that a whole host of situational variables, such as the degree to which the teacher comes to identify with the experimenter as opposed to the learner, really, really mattered. Haslam and others did some research where they used what's called immersive digital realism and professional actors, consistent with what they called an engaged followership explanation, the degree to which people were identifying with the experimenter or identifying with versus the learner was a solid predictor of whether or not people would be obedient and how obedient they were likely to be. As Berger found, there was near universal refusal by participants to continue after being given a certain level of prodding. So once they've been kind of pushed, there was a point at which participants just didn't want to go any farther. Now, the Asterton study, for me, when I took my first social psychology class, I found this a disturbing study, to say the least. When it was done by Hoffling et al. In 1966, they were wanting to know whether or not some of the same kind of bizarre decision-making that was seen in other kinds of research situations would happen in the real-world environment of healthcare. So participants were nurses, and they were on duty alone in a hospital ward. They didn't know they were participating in a study, so okay, ethical warning bell there. Again, 1966, this was before there were large-scale requirements for researchers to use the same standards that we use today for ethics. Each nurse was asked to respond to a call from a staff doctor that they didn't know. who was authorizing a dangerous dosage of a drug to be given to a patient on the ward. So basically, they're setting this up. These are nurses. They know about these medications. They know what levels of them are dangerous. But they are responding to an ask from an authority figure, a staff doctor. So the hierarchy in healthcare, doctors tell nurses what to do. Nurses deliver care. So this doctor that the nurse doesn't know asks them to administer a drug at a dangerous dosage level to a patient. And, the researchers want to know, will they follow the orders? Of the 22 nurses that were called, so this was a call on a phone, 21 didn't question the doctor. Now, that's not to say that they went out and were ready to administer the drug. They didn't say to the doctor, that's a problem. That dosage is incorrect. Now, the situation here, there's a procedure. If you're a nurse and you notice that the dosage is potentially dangerous, you're to raise that issue. Medication orders also aren't supposed to be taken over the phone. They're to be given in person at that time. The nurses were aware it was a clear overdose level, and the use of the medication in that way was not authorized through appropriate channels. So what they're looking at is, would the nurses ignore the protocols simply because they were asked to? Now, some people argued that, you're really not, this isn't a real world test. You're just looking at, the failure to question the order itself, not necessarily whether or not nurses would kill on command. Because the popular press at the time were like, yeah, nurses are not very ethical or moral, because they'll basically kill people at the behest of someone they don't even know. I think that's over-interpreting the findings. When a separate sample of 33 nurses was asked about this situation and what they would do if they were placed in it, they said they wouldn't obey the doctor's order. This is obviously different from what happened in the real situation where 22 nurses were phoned and all but one failed to question the order that they were given. So there's a disconnect there between what people say they will do and what they actually do. In the 70s, there was a replication of the study, and what they did differently, though, was they had an actual known doctor on the staff telephone an instruction to administer a known drug, Valium, at 3 times the recommended dosage. Other nurses were working, so the nurse who took the call wasn't able to ask their coworkers about the order, so that they were limited in their ability to consult. The findings were very different from what they found in the original study. All 18 nurses in the study accepted the order. 12 of them actually got the drug out. So they procured it. They accessed it and got it ready. Only 2, though, actually prepared to give the drug as ordered. So what that shows is they were following, but as they were moving in the direction of administering the drug, the brakes got put on. So only 2 were ready to give the drug as ordered. They stopped before taking those steps. So if you're going back to the original studies, the original aspartame study, you have obvious ethical problems. People are in a study, they don't know that they're in a study, and the situation was created was not normative. It wasn't how hospitals function. The nurses had no knowledge of the medication itself, and they had no opportunity to seek advice. An even more recent study by Krakow and Blass in the 90s, surveyed registered nurses on the subject of just following physician orders that could have bad consequences. About half of those who completed the survey said that they had carried out such orders, but they assigned most of the responsibility to the physicians who were telling them what to do. So to me, that's a much more clear indication of how you might apply these kinds of findings to the real world and help us understand how these kinds of medical errors get made. So, the conclusion was, in this replication by Rank and Jacobson, that if nurses were aware of the toxic effects of the drugs, and are given the opportunity to interact with other staff and to question what they're doing, most of them aren't going to administer the drug, causing an overdose. At the same time, though, when you look at the Krakow and Blass research, with nurses self-reporting that they had followed orders that they felt were dangerous at the behest of doctors, they're doing so even though they knew it was damaging, and they justified it by saying it wasn't their fault, it was the doctor's fault, and they were following instructions. So across all of these studies, looking at healthcare decision-making, it varies. The level of obedience varies tremendously, but we can all agree that this is a type of destructive obedience that really needs to be considered. Research of this kind has led to changes in procedures and protocols, which create some barriers to, say, administering incorrect drugs. Like, for instance, a doctor might miss that a patient they might overlook that a patient has a drug allergy and prescribe that drug. There are roadblocks in place that force you to question not just the dosages, but the type of drug that may be counterindicated by the particulars of the case. So research of this kind has sparked the creation of new protocols. Now, another example of a historical event that caused a lot of consternation, public outrage and horror, but it also sparked research being considered by social psychologists. The Jonestown Massacre occurred in 1978, but it's still discussed a lot today. Basically, Jim Jones had what's referred to now as a religious cult. It started out in the United States. Eventually, more than 900 people who were followers of Jim Jones relocated to Jonestown, Guyana. And as they were coming under increasing pressure from families who were trying to get their family members out of the cult, they were being visited by a lawmaker, by a congressperson, I believe, and there was a shooting, and members of the Jonestown group shot some of these visitors. So Jim Jones basically knew that they were going to be shut down, and his plan was, if they were ever going to face the cult being broken apart and him being arrested, they would all die, and they would all die together. So basically, hundreds of people died by mass suicide by drinking cyanide-laced Kool-Aid, which is the origin of the phrase that we sometimes use when we're talking about people who believe bizarre things as having drunk the Kool-Aid. Jones and other cult leaders use a variety of manipulative compliance techniques in order to create an obedience hierarchy, but also a lot of subtle, slowly evolving patterns of compliance and obedience, and avoidance of individualism. So what kind of techniques did he use? And it's true of Jim Jones, but also pretty much any sort of cult-like organization out there. The foot in the door technique was used to slowly increase the level of financial support that people were required to provide to the temple. So originally, people were kind of brought in and asked to make very, very small contributions. It could be contributions of a little bit of time, and then eventually, though, by the time they get to it, they're not going to walk up and say, "Hey, give me your entire retirement fund and sell your house and give me the money." They're not going to do that. They're going to get very slowly increasing the amount of money and resources that people were giving. Eventually, lots of the people who went to Guyana, they gave up all of their financial resources and gave them to the temple. He also had people who were recruiters. They would just ask people that were walking by, and this was especially when they were still in the United States. They would just ask people to be helpful to the poor. And when they refused to do that, they asked them to just give 5 minutes. So here was the door in the face technique. So they would first say, will you volunteer your time and resources to help the poor? That was the ask that is way too big. When they said no, the recruiters said, just give me 5 minutes stuffing envelopes. It will help me out so much. That's a much smaller ask. So you get them in by contributing that behavior. Once you get them there, then the door is back open and your foot is in. So then you switch to the foot in the door and to getting more and more compliance. He eventually, once there was a lot of pressure coming from the federal government about tax evasion with this organization, so he packed up the entire group, as many of them who would go, and moved them to another country in the jungle environment, and that essentially cut off the members from outside social influence. So this was using creating an informational vacuum where the only source of information that was reliable was Jim Jones and his leadership group. Primarily was Jim Jones. So the only source of information they had was the leader of the cult. They had no access to outsiders, no family members, no news, no radio, no television, no nothing. So that created an informational vacuum that allows for a great deal of persuasion. So as I said before, that phrase, drinking the Kool-Aid, has become synonymous with a failure to question authority in a very powerful social situation. And that concludes part 3.